Welcome back, fellow wannabe writers. Today I want to share a process I've recently come across that can help with never finding yourself stuck again and always having story ideas and inspiration ready to go. So the process is inspired by what professional musicians, DJs do to build up their music arsenal and to build up their skill set. And conveniently enough, it is also a solution to that problem of remembering stories you've read, watched, and remembering why you liked them. So in this video, we're going to look at what the process is and how to implement it for storytelling. I first came across this process when I watched the masterclass from Questlove on DJing. In it, he describes a music gathering and organizing process that he uses in a very systematic way to build up his skill level and also the music collection that he uses. And what I did is take his process and adapt it to storytelling. So let me quickly go through what his process looks like. So in step one, he will collect music during the week actively. So he saves music that he comes across, or he will actively look for specific types of new genres or whatever topic that he comes across, just to have a collection of new music to explore. Then in step two, in a weekly session of about 2 to 4 hours, he goes through the music and analyzes it and basically familiarizes himself with the songs, what they're like, and picks out the elements that he likes. And in step three, what he creates is his own personal library of music that he likes, that he uses, elements that he likes, and he organizes it according to different playlists. So he has playlists like playlists for specific events that he's DJing at, or he has top favorites that he always comes back to, favorites that he falls back on if an event doesn't go according to plan. He has lists that he has organized according to a specific element in a song or a beat where all the songs play into each other. So basically what he has is really this whole arsenal of music that is according to his taste, the elements that he likes, and it's organized in the way that creates the style that he's known for. So that is what I want to do. I want to create my own personal library of stories that I love, but the elements in them specifically, and have them organized in a way that I can not just remember them, but also come back to when I feel stuck and specifically remember why I loved, for example, a certain scene in a story so much, or why I like the character so much. Personally, I've come across this problem of coming across elements in stories that I love, but not remembering completely where I've seen them before. So something seems familiar, but then when I try to list other stories that I've read or watched where there's a similar kind of character, I come up short because it's so hard to remember all the stories that we've come across. So let's take a closer look at what this process looks like for storytelling. If you haven't already got one, the first thing that you need is some sort of to read or to watch list. A list, a place where you can store all the stories you come across that you want to check out. I've got mine stored on my phone, and every time I come across a new recommendation, I basically note it down by just, storing the image of it. Now, there are different ways to come across stories that you want to read or to watch. There are recommendations that you will probably get from friends or family, or what I do is I get a lot of my recommendations on YouTube. The types of stories that get recommended are the types of stories that you like, right? So that's kind of the narrow focus of going according to your own taste. But there's also a second approach, which is to actively look for stories that you wouldn't normally check out, that aren't within the genre that you like, or that aren't the type of story that you like. And the whole point of doing this is really to come across as many different types of stories as possible, so that you can get as many different types of inspirations and elements of story to gather up. So it is as much about gathering inspiration that you personally like as it is about expanding your own horizon of stories and knowledge of stories. For this second approach, there are different ways that you could come across stories that aren't naturally in your taste or that don't naturally get recommended to you. One way that Questlove mentions in his masterclass is that he would go randomly and search for certain elements. So for example, he mentioned something about okay, this week I'm just looking for songs that have some sort of color reference in them. So he's just looking for songs that have colors in the title. What I like to do when it comes to storytelling is to basically eat up a certain type of story. So for example, if you start reading a zombie story, you then go and read all of them, or you watch all of them, or also go according to location, for example. So I don't just watch one movie about people on a plane. I'm watching all of them and I'm reading all of them. So it's really just pick an element kind of at random and then look for stories that have the same element in them and consume all of them. When first starting out with this gathering process, it is really more about first looking for the kinds of stories that you yourself like. So just the recommendations that you come across and noting them down and actively looking at them. But then the second step would probably be to look for stories that have elements in them or are similar to the kind of story that you're writing. And then the third step is really more about practice, about learning more about storytelling and expanding your storytelling horizon and story knowledge in terms of what kinds of stories there are. So once you get to that third stage where it's really more about just looking for what exists and exploring new stuff, then it's really more about the approaches of picking a random element, looking for stories within that, or it's also then more about, for example, going for stories that you would normally never read or would never watch because they're not something that you normally like. So for example, if you're someone who's completely into teen romance or young adult romance and you like that very addictive kind of roller coaster storytelling, going for something like, for example, classical literature that is no romance, just other types of classical literature, and eating that up and learning those kind of story elements could help you to develop a completely different kind of style, right? It mixes into your existing style, your existing story elements that you use over and over, and alters them. So that's the whole point of this exercise, really, of expanding your horizon. It's about finding new inspiration that eventually will get mixed into your own existing style and will create something new over time. And that's really, again, inspired by what musicians very much do. So if you go and look at an interview from your favorite musicians, most likely you will find that they are very well versed in all kinds of music and all kinds of genre, and you have like the most metal rock fans, right, who know a lot about all kinds of other genres that you wouldn't necessarily associate with them. But that's the whole point, right? You can't create something new and you can't create your own style if you're only transfixed within one genre or one story type. And the same is true for music. We can adapt it in the same way by basically eating up as many types of inspirations and styles as possible. You can start to mix in other things that create what you will like and what is your signature. Then the next step is to analyze the stories and to take time to read them, watch them, but also really focus in on all the elements that make them great and that you like. So it's not just about having free time and reading your favorite stories, it's really about looking for the stuff in them that will help you get better at your own craft. Now, unlike music, it's probably going to take you longer to analyze one story than it would 2 to 4 hours. So what I like to do is I like to take a span of days and only focus on one story. So for a duration of a couple of days, maybe sometimes it's 2 or 3 weeks even, where I only read one book and only focus in on that. And sometimes, depending on how much I like the story, I reread it right away. So it's really about having that focus on that one particular story and not necessarily as much about how long that focus time lasts, right? It depends on what kind of story you have. Movies will be faster than reading an entire book. Now, when it comes to the analyzation process, something that I like to do is to first, before ever starting to read the story or watch the story, I note down why I came across this story in the first place. So if it was recommended to me, I note down what exactly was recommended to me. If I came across a lot of stories, I read them because I came across like a snippet of an element in it. So for example, I know something about a specific character, or I have a hint of a specific key moment that is going to happen, and that's really what caught my attention. So I note down what I know about a story before ever reading it or watching it, just to hold on to basically, you know, what sold me on reading this story, so that I have kind of like an idea for myself what about this story was so intriguing before I get so familiar with the story that I can't remember that anymore. And another thing that I do is I write down what I expect the story to be before I ever read it or watch it. And the reason I do that is, for one thing, so afterwards I can compare if the story turned out to be what I expected it to be. Is it like, am I satisfied with the kind of story that I got, you know, were my expectations met, or was the marketing somewhat misleading? So that's more kind of like to get a sense of how marketing and the story itself tie into each other, and what is satisfying and what is really annoying as a reader. But the other reason is mainly because before starting a story, there's something in it that I like, right? And it kind of sparks my imagination, and because of that, I have a sort of hazy vision of what kind of story I want to read. So I write down that kind of story that I'm expecting, that I want to see, and even if the story that I get turns out to be something completely different, I still have this original expectation that is actually kind of a starting point for the type of story that I would want to read and therefore write, right? So sometimes when I have like this expectation, I read the story and it turns out to be something that I completely obsess over and love, right? But then by the time that I'm done with the story, my original expectation is gone, right? And I'm completely focused in on the actual story and what it is, that I can't remember it anymore. So that's why I write all that stuff down before I ever start the story, so that I have this comparison that teaches me a lot about storytelling, but also about marketing, like I said. And what it also does is it will teach you a lot about your own preferences and what you want to see. And after all of that, once I've read the story, once I've watched the movie, I am going to step 3. And step 3 is really where it's all about creating the library. So the first thing that you want to do is to create categories that work for you. Because it is your own personal library, you decide how you want to use it and what makes sense for you. I can give you a recommendation of what I did and why. So what you can see here is that I created subsections of story elements that I want to remember. So something that I want to remember when it comes to the stories that I've watched or read are the moments in it. For me, those moments that I track here are the moments that I come back to when rereading a book or rewatching a movie. So those are my favorite moments. Those are the moments that spark a lot of emotion and the kinds of moments that you would remember about the story years after you first read it. So for example, right now I read the book series All for the Game, which is a young adult kind of romance with sports elements in it. And one moment from that series which I reread a lot is basically the moment where the central couple have this "are you okay" couple moment, you know, where one of them was in danger and got saved and they meet again for the first time after that, right? And have like this interaction of checking in on each other, but they're not yet a couple, so it's a bit restraint, but also the moment where they realize that they are basically a couple now, right? So that kind of moment, that's something that I would note down here just to remember why I liked the series so much, you know, in terms of the moments that made the series, you know, the highlight moments, so that when I ever want to write something similar myself, I can go back to my library, check those kinds of moments that sparked that kind of inspiration for me when I read it, you know, what I liked, and then go back to the book and reread that section. So it's a way to basically capture how you felt about certain moments in stories so that you can revisit them when you need inspiration for something similar. And then another category that I track are characters. So I have characters noted down according to what kind of character it is in terms of what makes them special. So for example, coming back to my current example, so in the All for the Game series there is the protagonist Neil, who is basically a runaway character, and because of that he has a certain skill set in terms of survival, and he has specific behaviors in terms of he doesn't trust anyone, and a lot of normal stuff is foreign to him, right? And the reason why I note the characters down here the way that I did is because for me, what is interesting about this particular character type is I like to see the survival skills. I find that fascinating, and I also really like this viewpoint of someone seeing normal everyday stuff and feeling foreign to them. So it's kind of like making familiar stuff feel new again. So that's why I really like these characters, and that's why I sort them the way that I do, so that I can go and find characters and stories where those two elements are present for my inspiration. But I also track down storytelling elements that I like. So for example, when it comes to character introduction, I noted down how Daryl was introduced in The Walking Dead because I really liked how he was introduced. It was this approach of having, you know, he's talked about before we ever see him. We're already told before we ever see him that there's something to be afraid of, kind of like that he has a temper or maybe he's dangerous. So that's something that I really like in stories. So that's why I'm noting it down, kind of not just to remember the kind of story or the kind of element in the story and where it came from, but rather something in terms of how the story is told that I like. Okay, so this is it. This is the whole process. And like I said, the whole point of having this library is really for you to store stories that you liked, the moments, the characters, story elements, and to be able to have a place to go to whenever you find yourself stuck or whenever you don't know what kind of story you want to write, to browse through the elements in other stories that once got you excited and have an ability to recreate that original energy that they created in you. So yeah, this is all I've got. Other than that, I will see you next time. Bye!